Mason Reed's calloused hands tightened on the steering wheel as flames erupted from the crumpled Mercedes ahead. The afternoon heat shimmered off Highway 91, but nothing compared to the inferno consuming the luxury sedan that had just careened into the guardrail. Inside, a woman in an expensive cream blazer hung unconscious against her seatbelt, blood trickling down her temple like crimson tears. Her manicured fingers still clutched a shattered phone, diamond wedding ring catching the firelight. 10-year-old Tyler pressed against the passenger window, his voice barely a whisper. "Dad, the car's gonna explode!" Mason was already running. The same instincts that had guided him through darker moments kicked in as he yanked open the twisted door. What he didn't know was that saving this stranger's life would unravel a secret he'd buried for years. A secret that would make her question everything she thought she knew about heroes, and make him wonder if some people were worth more than others. Mason's boots crunched on broken glass as he reached the smoking wreckage. The acrid smell of burning rubber filled his nostrils, mixing with something far more dangerous: gasoline. A steady drip, drip, drip echoed from beneath the crumpled hood, each drop feeding the growing puddle that reflected the orange flames dancing above. Tyler's voice carried across the desert wind, high and tight with fear. "Dad, please be careful." But Mason had already disappeared into the haze, his weathered face set with the same determination that had once earned him a chest full of medals he never talked about. The woman's breathing was shallow, labored. Up close, Mason could see the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the kind that came from carrying burdens too heavy for one person. Her cream blazer was tailored perfectly, probably cost more than Mason made in 3 months, but it was torn now, stained with blood and motor oil. She couldn't have been much older than his late wife Sarah, maybe mid-30s, with the kind of bone structure that belonged in boardrooms, making decisions that affected millions. Mason worked his hands under her arms, feeling the dead weight of unconsciousness as he prepared to lift. "Come on, lady," he whispered, his voice rough with smoke and something deeper. "You're not dying on my watch." The seatbelt was jammed, twisted in the impact, and precious seconds ticked away as Mason fumbled for his pocket knife. The flames were spreading now, creeping along the undercarriage with hungry fingers. Behind him, he could hear other cars stopping, voices shouting warnings, but their words seemed to come from another world. In this moment, there was only the unconscious woman, the growing heat, and the memory of other people he'd failed to save. The seatbelt snapped free with a sharp click that sounded like a gunshot in the confined space. Mason lifted her clear of the wreckage just as the first explosion rocked the car, sending a shower of sparks into the desert air. He stumbled backward, the woman's limp form cradled against his chest, and collapsed onto the hot asphalt 20 feet away. Tyler was beside them instantly, his young face pale but determined as he pressed his hands against the woman's wrist. "She's got a pulse, Dad. Weak, but it's there." The woman's eyelids fluttered, then opened to reveal the deepest blue eyes Mason had ever seen. For a moment they stared at each other in silence, her gaze unfocused but somehow piercing. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling flames. Mason nodded once, then looked away, suddenly uncomfortable with the intensity of her stare. "Ambulance is coming," he said simply. "Just rest." But even as the sirens wailed in the distance, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment had changed something fundamental about his carefully ordered world. 2 days later, Mason stood outside Riverside General Hospital with a bouquet of sunflowers from his garden, feeling more nervous than he had any right to be. Tyler bounced beside him, his backpack stuffed with get-well cards he'd made in art class, each one decorated with fire trucks and stick-figure heroes. The hospital's automatic doors whooshed open, releasing a wave of antiseptic-scented air that made Mason's chest tighten with memories of Sarah's final weeks. He almost turned around right then, but Tyler was already marching toward the information desk with the single-minded determination of a 10-year-old on a mission. "We're here to see the lady from the car crash," Tyler announced to the receptionist, who smiled at his earnest expression. "Carolyn Cross, room 412, she replied after checking her computer. The name meant nothing to Mason, but something about the way the woman's voice dropped to a whisper when she said it made him pause. As they rode the elevator to the 4th floor, Tyler chattered excitedly about how cool it was that they were real-life heroes, but Mason found himself wondering why someone named Carolyn Cross had been driving alone on a forgotten stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere. The private room was unlike anything Mason had seen in a hospital. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the valley, and the furniture looked like it belonged in an expensive hotel rather than a medical facility. Caroline sat propped against silk pillows, her blonde hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that somehow made her look both younger and more vulnerable. She was dressed in a cream silk pajama set that probably cost more than Mason's monthly mortgage payment. But when she saw them standing in the doorway, her face lit up with genuine warmth. "You came," she said, and there was something almost surprised in her voice, as if kindness was a foreign concept. Tyler bounded forward with his cards, launching into an enthusiastic explanation of each crayon masterpiece, while Caroline listened with the kind of focused attention that made Mason suspect she didn't spend much time around children. When Tyler finally paused for breath, Caroline turned those remarkable blue eyes on Mason. "I never properly thanked you," she said quietly. "The doctors told me another 30 seconds and—" She trailed off, but they all knew how the sentence ended. Mason shifted uncomfortably under her gaze, the sunflowers suddenly feeling foolish in his work-roughened hands. "Anyone would have done the same thing," he said, but Caroline shook her head slowly. "No," she replied, her voice carrying the weight of experience. "They really wouldn't have." There was something in her tone that suggested she'd learned this lesson the hard way, and Mason found himself wondering what kind of life had taught a woman like her that heroism was rare. Tyler, oblivious to the undercurrents, was already pulling out his phone to show Caroline pictures of their farm. "This is our rooster, Sergeant Pepper," Tyler said proudly, swiping through photos of chickens and cornfields with the enthusiasm of a travel agent selling paradise. Caroline studied each image with genuine interest, asking questions about crop rotation and chicken breeds that surprised Mason with their intelligence. When Tyler showed her a picture of their small farmhouse, with its peeling paint and hand-built front porch, something shifted in Caroline's expression. "It looks peaceful," she said softly, and for just a moment, Mason caught a glimpse of profound loneliness behind her composed facade. The next week passed in a blur of hospital visits that gradually became something Mason looked forward to rather than simply endured. Caroline had been moved to a rehabilitation facility in town, a modest place that seemed strange for someone who could clearly afford much better. When Mason asked about it, she simply said she preferred the quiet, but there was something evasive in her answer that made him suspect there was more to the story. Tyler had become her unofficial entertainment committee, bringing new drawings and increasingly elaborate stories about farm life that made Caroline laugh in a way that seemed to surprise her. During one visit, Mason found Caroline sitting in the facility's small garden, staring at the mountains with an expression he couldn't quite read. She was wearing jeans and a simple sweater, the first time he'd seen her in anything that looked remotely ordinary. And the effect was startling. Without the expensive clothes and jewelry, she looked younger, more approachable, like someone who might actually belong in his world. "The doctors say I can be discharged tomorrow," she said when he approached, but there was no excitement in her voice. "That's good news," Mason replied, settling onto the bench beside her. "I'm sure you're eager to get back to your life." Caroline was quiet for so long that Mason began to think she hadn't heard him. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "What if I don't want to go back?" The question hung in the air between them like a confession, and Mason felt something shift in his chest. He recognized that tone. He'd heard it in his own voice during the dark months after Sarah's death, when the idea of moving forward felt impossible. "Everyone deserves a second chance," he said finally, the words carrying more weight than he'd intended. Caroline turned to look at him then, really look at him, as if she was trying to solve some complex equation. "Is that what you think this is?" she asked. "A second chance?" Mason met her gaze steadily, ignoring the way his pulse quickened under her scrutiny. "I think sometimes life puts people exactly where they need to be," he said, even if it doesn't make sense at the time. 3 weeks after the accident, Carolyn appeared at Mason's farm driving a modest Honda Civic that looked completely out of place with her usual style. Tyler spotted her first, racing across the yard with his arms outstretched like an airplane, nearly bowling her over in his enthusiasm. "Ms. Caroline, did you come to see the chickens? Sergeant Pepper laid 2 eggs today." Carolyn caught him in a hug that seemed to surprise them both, and Mason noticed the way her face softened when Tyler wrapped his small arms around her waist. She stayed for dinner that night, sitting at their scratched wooden table like she belonged there, listening to Tyler's elaborate plans for a science fair project about solar energy. Mason found himself watching her more than was probably polite, fascinated by the way she seemed to transform in the warm light of their kitchen. Without the trappings of wealth, without the careful composure he'd seen at the hospital, she was simply Caroline. Funny, intelligent, and unexpectedly at ease with their simple life. When Tyler fell asleep on the couch after dinner, she helped Mason carry him to bed, moving through their small house with the quiet confidence of someone who'd done this before. "You're a good father," she said, as they stood in Tyler's doorway, watching his peaceful sleep. Mason felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling he got whenever someone commented on his parenting. "I try," he said simply. "Sarah was the natural. I'm just figuring it out as I go." Caroline was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was thoughtful. The best parents usually are. There was something in her tone that made Mason suspect she was speaking from experience, and he found himself wondering about her own childhood, her own family. They sat on the front porch afterward, sharing a beer and watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky. The silence between them was comfortable, broken only by the distant sound of coyotes and the gentle creaking of the old porch swing. "I need to tell you something," Caroline said suddenly, her voice tight with an emotion Mason couldn't identify. "About why I was on that highway." Mason waited, sensing that whatever she was about to say would change everything between them. "My name isn't just Caroline Cross," she began, her fingers twisting together in her lap. "It's Caroline Cross, CEO of Cross Industries. We're one of the largest clean energy companies in the country." Mason felt the bottom drop out of his stomach, not because of her wealth, he'd already suspected she was rich, but because of what her revelation meant. She'd been lying to him, or at least hiding the truth, and the easy intimacy they'd been building suddenly felt fragile and false. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Caroline turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Because what happened to me wasn't an accident. Someone cut my brake lines. They wanted me dead, and they're still out there." The words hit Mason like a physical blow, and suddenly her modest rental car, her choice of a simple rehabilitation facility, Her reluctance to return to her old life all made terrible sense. She wasn't just recovering from injuries, she was hiding. "Who would want to hurt you?" Mason asked, though he was already beginning to understand. Corporate espionage, hostile takeovers, the kind of high-stakes games that people like him never had to worry about. Carolyn laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I'm about to sign a $5 billion contract with the federal government for solar infrastructure. There are people who would do anything to stop that deal." She paused, looking out at the dark fields that surrounded his property. "I came here because I thought I'd be safe, because no one would think to look for Caroline Cross on a small farm in the middle of nowhere." Mason felt a cold weight settling in his stomach as the implications became clear. "And now you've put Tyler and me in danger," he said quietly. Carolyn's face crumpled, and he realized his words had hit harder than he'd intended. "I never meant for that to happen," she whispered. "I was going to leave after I was discharged, disappear somewhere else, but then—" She gestured helplessly at the porch, the house, the life they'd been building together. "I couldn't. For the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged somewhere." The next morning brought a cold dose of reality in the form of a phone call from Tyler's school. Someone had been asking questions about him, showing his picture to other students, claiming to be from a modeling agency. Mason's blood ran cold as he listened to the principal's concerned voice, and he found himself gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles went white. After he hung up, he stared at Caroline across the breakfast table, seeing not the woman who'd become so important to him, but the billionaire who'd brought danger to his doorstep. "You have to go," he said flatly, ignoring the way her face went pale. "This morning, before someone gets hurt." Caroline nodded slowly, as if she'd been expecting this moment. "I know," she said quietly. "I've already made arrangements. There's a place in Montana completely off the grid. I'll disappear and this will all blow over." But even as she said the words, Mason could see the defeat in her posture, the way she seemed to be shrinking back into herself. Tyler chose that moment to come bounding into the kitchen, his hair still messy from sleep, completely oblivious to the tension crackling between the adults. "Miss Caroline, are we still going to work on my solar panel project today?" The innocent question hit Mason like a punch to the gut, and he saw Caroline close her eyes as if in pain. "Actually, buddy," Mason said carefully, "Miss Caroline has to go away for a while." Tyler's face fell, and the disappointment in his young eyes was almost more than Mason could bear. "But why?" Tyler asked, looking between them with the kind of clear-eyed confusion that only children possessed. "Did I do something wrong?" Caroline knelt down to his level, and Mason could see her struggling to maintain her composure. "You didn't do anything wrong, sweetheart," she said softly. "Sometimes grown-ups have complicated problems that make it hard to stay in one place." She pulled something from her pocket, a delicate silver bracelet that caught the morning light. "This was my mother's. I want you to have it, to remember that even when people have to go away, it doesn't mean they stop caring." Tyler took the bracelet with the solemnity of a child receiving a sacred trust, but Mason could see the questions building behind his eyes. Questions about why someone would have to leave if they cared, about why caring wasn't enough to make people stay. These were questions Mason couldn't answer without destroying his son's faith in the fundamental fairness of the world, so he simply pulled Tyler into a hug and promised they'd talk more later. 2 days after Caroline left, Mason's carefully constructed life began to unravel in ways he never could have anticipated. It started with a phone call from the Veterans Administration, informing him that his application for farm improvement grants had been approved, grants he'd never applied for, processed by lawyers he'd never hired. Then came the letter from Tyler's school, announcing that his son had been selected for a prestigious STEM scholarship, funded by something called the Cross Foundation. Mason stared at the paperwork spread across his kitchen table, feeling a combination of rage and humiliation that made his hands shake. Every dollar, every opportunity, every piece of good fortune that had come their way in recent weeks, all of it traced back to Caroline's money. She'd been orchestrating their lives from behind the scenes, playing fairy godmother with her billions, while he'd been stupid enough to believe in coincidence. The worst part wasn't the deception itself, but the way it made him question every moment they'd shared, every smile, every quiet conversation on the porch. Tyler found him there an hour later, still staring at the papers with the kind of hollow expression that used to worry Sarah. "Dad, are you okay?" Mason looked up at his son's concerned face and felt something crack open in his chest. How could he explain that the woman they'd both grown to love had been manipulating them from the beginning? How could he tell Tyler that her kindness had been bought and paid for, just another business transaction in a world where everything had a price? "I need to make a phone call," Mason said finally, reaching for his cell phone with hands that still trembled slightly. He'd kept Caroline's number, telling himself it was just in case of emergency, but now he realized there was nothing emergency about the rage building in his chest. She answered on the second ring, her voice cautious. "Mason, is everything okay?" The genuine concern in her tone only made his anger burn brighter. "How long were you planning to keep lying to me?" he asked without preamble. The silence on the other end stretched so long that Mason began to wonder if she'd hung up. When Caroline finally spoke, her voice was small and broken. "You found out about the grants." It wasn't a question, and Mason could hear the resignation in her tone. "All of it," he confirmed. "The scholarship, the legal help, probably the convenient job offers I've been getting too. Was any of it real, Caroline? Or was I just another project for you to manage?" "It wasn't like that," she said quickly, but Mason could hear the defensiveness creeping into her voice. "I wanted to help, to show my gratitude in some way. You saved my life, Mason. How was I supposed to just walk away and pretend that didn't matter?" Her words hit him like a slap, reducing everything they'd built together to a simple transaction. "By treating me like a person instead of a charity case," he shot back. "By being honest instead of pulling strings behind my back like I'm some kind of puppet." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by what sounded like Caroline crying softly on the other end of the line. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with tears. "You're right," she whispered. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to care about people without trying to fix everything for them. I've spent my whole life believing that money could solve any problem, and I thought—" She trailed off, but Mason could fill in the blanks. She thought he would be grateful. She thought poor people were always grateful. "The scholarship," Mason said quietly. "Take Tyler's name off the list." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Mason, please, don't punish him for my mistakes. That scholarship could change his entire future." But Mason was already shaking his head, even though she couldn't see him. "His future isn't for sale," he said firmly, "and neither is his father's pride." He ended the call before she could respond, then sat in his empty kitchen, surrounded by the silence that had become his constant companion since Sarah's death. 3 weeks passed in a haze of routine and regret. Mason threw himself into farm work with the kind of desperate intensity that had gotten him through the worst days after Sarah's funeral, but no amount of physical labor could quiet the voice in his head that whispered he'd made a terrible mistake. Tyler moved through their daily routines with the subdued behavior of a child who sensed something was broken, but didn't understand what or how to fix it. He stopped asking about Caroline after the first few days, but Mason caught him sometimes staring at the silver bracelet she'd left behind, turning it over in his small hands like a talisman. The call came at 2 in the morning on a Thursday, jolting Mason from restless sleep with its shrill urgency. He fumbled for his phone in the darkness, expecting to hear Tyler calling from a nightmare, or maybe one of his elderly neighbors with some crisis. Instead, he was greeted by an unfamiliar voice, crisp and professional despite the late hour. "Mr. Reed, this is Dr. Martinez at Cedars-Sinai Hospital in Los Angeles. I'm calling about Caroline Cross. You're listed as her emergency contact." Mason's blood turned to ice water in his veins. "What happened?" he managed to ask, though part of him already knew. The doctor's voice was carefully controlled, the kind of tone medical professionals used when delivering bad news to family members. "Ms. Cross was attacked in her home earlier tonight. She's stable now, but her injuries are severe. She's been asking for you." The phone slipped from Mason's nerveless fingers, clattering onto the hardwood floor as the full weight of his failure crashed down on him. He'd sent her away. He'd pushed her out of their lives because his pride was more important than her safety, and now she was lying in a hospital bed, alone and hurt, because he'd been too stubborn to see past his own wounded feelings. Tyler appeared in his doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes, drawn by the sound of the dropped phone. "Dad? What's wrong?" Mason looked at his son's worried face and felt the last of his anger crumble into dust. "Get dressed," he said quietly. "We're going to Los Angeles." Tyler didn't ask questions, just nodded with the serious expression of a child who understood that some situations were too big for explanations. As they threw clothes into a duffel bag, Mason's hands moved automatically while his mind raced through possibilities and regrets. He should have protected her. He should have insisted she stay, should have figured out a way to keep her safe instead of sending her back to the wolves alone. The drive to Los Angeles passed in a blur of desert highways and desperate prayers. Tyler dozed fitfully in the passenger seat, clutching Caroline's bracelet like a lifeline, while Mason pushed his old truck harder than it had ever been pushed before. The radio droned softly in the background, but Mason wasn't listening to the words, just the white noise that helped drown out the voice in his head, listing all the ways he'd failed the people he was supposed to protect. Cedars-Sinai Hospital was a gleaming monument to modern medicine, all glass and steel and efficient compassion. Mason felt deeply out of place in his work clothes and dusty boots, but the nurses seemed to recognize something in his face because they directed him to Caroline's room without the usual bureaucratic delays. Tyler stayed close to his side, his young eyes wide as they navigated the maze of corridors that smelled like antiseptic and quiet desperation. Caroline looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed with electronic vigilance. Her face was bruised, one eye swollen shut, and Mason could see the edge of bandages beneath her hospital gown. But when she saw them standing in the doorway, her remaining eye lit up with something that might have been hope. "You came," she whispered, her voice hoarse from whatever had happened to her. Mason nodded, not trusting himself to speak past the emotion clogging his throat. Tyler approached the bed with the careful reverence of a child in the presence of something sacred and broken. "Ms. Caroline, does it hurt really bad?" His innocent question seemed to unlock something in Caroline's carefully controlled facade, and tears began sliding down her bruised cheeks. "Not anymore," she said softly, reaching out with a bandaged hand to touch his face. "Not now that you're here." Mason pulled up a chair beside the bed, feeling the weight of all his unspoken apologies pressing against his ribs like stones. "I'm sorry," he said simply, but Caroline shook her head as much as her injuries would allow. "You were right," she replied. "About everything. I don't know how to love people without trying to control their lives. I don't know how to help without making it about my own guilt." She paused, struggling with words that seemed too big for the space between them. "But I'm learning. Or I want to learn, if you'll let me." The next few days blurred together in a haze of hospital visits and difficult conversations. Caroline's attacker had been caught, a hired gun working for Marcus Blackwood, a business rival who'd grown desperate as Caroline's solar energy contracts threatened his oil investments. The police assured them that Blackwood's entire operation had been dismantled, that the threat was over, but Mason could see the lingering fear in Caroline's eyes whenever someone unexpected entered her room. It was Tyler who finally broke through the wall of awkward politeness that had settled between the adults. On their third day at the hospital, he climbed carefully onto Caroline's bed, mindful of her injuries, and fixed her with the kind of direct stare that only children could manage. "Are you going to come home with us when you get better?" he asked with the matter-of-fact tone he used when discussing important matters, like what to have for breakfast or whether it would rain. Caroline looked helplessly at Mason, clearly afraid to answer without knowing where he stood. Mason found himself thinking about the empty spaces in their house, the way Caroline's laughter had filled corners that had been silent since Sarah's death. He thought about Tyler's face when he worked on science projects with her, the way his son seemed to bloom under her attention. Most importantly, he thought about the woman lying broken in this hospital bed, not because she'd been living some glamorous life, but because she'd been trying to make the world a better place. "That depends," Mason said slowly, watching Caroline's face. "Are you ready to be part of a family that doesn't have much money but has a lot of love? Are you ready to help with homework and chicken chores and all the boring stuff that comes with belonging somewhere?" Caroline's remaining eye filled with fresh tears, but these were different. Tears of relief and possibility rather than pain. "I don't know how," she admitted, "but I want to learn. If you'll teach me." Mason reached for her unbandaged hand, carefully weaving their fingers together. "We'll figure it out as we go," he said, echoing the words he'd once spoken about parenthood. "The best families usually do." Tyler bounced excitedly on the bed, already making plans for all the things they'd do when Caroline came home, completely oblivious to the profound shift that had just occurred in their small universe. "Ladies and gentlemen," Caroline said into the microphone, her voice carrying clearly through the enormous room, "I want to tell you about the most important business deal of my life. It wasn't a merger or acquisition. It wasn't a billion-dollar government contract. It was the day a man with calloused hands and a generous heart taught me the difference between having wealth and having worth." The spotlight found Mason in the wings, and he felt his face burn as hundreds of eyes turned his way. This wasn't his world. He belonged in barns and cornfields, not ballrooms and formal dinners, but Caroline had insisted he be here for this moment. Tyler sat at a front table, wearing his first real suit and grinning like he'd won the lottery, completely at ease in a way that reminded Mason painfully of Sarah. "Mason Reed saved my life twice," Caroline continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Once from a burning car, and once from a life that was burning just as surely from the inside out. He taught me that heroism isn't about grand gestures or public recognition. It's about showing up day after day for the people who matter. It's about loving imperfectly but completely. And it's about understanding that the most valuable things in life can't be bought, only earned." She paused, looking directly at Mason with an expression that made his heart skip several beats. "Tonight, Cross Industries is announcing the Reed Foundation, a scholarship program for children of military families who want to pursue careers in sustainable energy. But more than that, we're announcing a partnership between two people who've learned that love isn't about fixing each other. It's about growing together towards something better than either could be alone." The applause was thunderous, but Mason barely heard it. He was thinking about the small velvet box in his jacket pocket, the simple ring he'd bought with money he'd saved from legitimate farm sales, not charity disguised as opportunity. He was thinking about the conversation he'd had with Tyler 3 days ago, when his son had solemnly given his permission for Mason to propose to Caroline, as long as she promised to keep helping with the chickens. Later that night, they sat on the hotel balcony overlooking the lights of Los Angeles. Caroline's expensive gown traded for jeans and one of Mason's old flannel shirts. Tyler had fallen asleep on the couch inside, exhausted by his first taste of high society, but not before extracting promises from both adults that they'd be home in time for him to show his solar panel to his class on Monday. "Are you ready for this?" Mason asked, gesturing toward the city sprawling below them. "The scrutiny, the attention, all the ways our lives are going to change?" Caroline leaned against his shoulder, solid and warm in the cool night air. "I'm ready for us," she said simply. "Everything else is just details." Mason pulled the ring box from his pocket, holding it between them like a question that had been waiting months to be asked. "Caroline Cross," he said quietly, "will you marry a farmer who doesn't have much to offer except a lot of love and really good homemade bread?" Caroline's laughter was bright and clear, cutting through the night like music. "Mason Reed," she replied, taking the ring with hands that trembled only slightly. "I thought you'd never ask." The ring was simple, a single diamond that caught the city lights, but when she slipped it onto her finger, it looked exactly right. They were married 3 months later in the small church where Mason and Sarah had exchanged vows 15 years earlier. Caroline wore her mother's dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and Mason wore the same suit he'd gotten married in the first time, because some traditions were worth keeping. Tyler served as best man, ring bearer, and wedding coordinator, taking his duties so seriously that the elderly pastor had to hide his smile behind his prayer book. The reception was held in Mason's barn, decorated with sunflowers from Caroline's new garden and powered by the solar panels that had become Tyler's obsession. 300 guests mingled in the space where Mason stored his tractor. Corporate executives in designer suits standing next to local farmers in their Sunday best, all united by their connection to the couple who'd somehow made an impossible love story work. Caroline's father attended, a stern man in an expensive suit who spent most of the evening looking around the barn like he'd stumbled into an alien world. But Mason caught him smiling when Tyler dragged him over to see the chickens, explaining in earnest detail about egg production and the social hierarchy of poultry. By the end of the night, the billionaire industrialist was discussing sustainable farming practices with Mason's neighbors, his tie loosened and his corporate armor temporarily set aside. The best moment came just before sunset, when the photographer asked for a family portrait. Mason stood in the center, his arms around Caroline and Tyler, all 3 of them slightly wind-blown and completely happy. In the background, the solar panels caught the last rays of sunlight, and beyond them, the cornfield stretched toward the mountains in endless rows of green possibility. "You know what I love most about this picture?" Caroline said later, studying the image on the photographer's camera display. "We all look like we belong together." Mason kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her shampoo mixed with hay and happiness. "That's because we do," he said simply. "We always did. We just had to figure out how to stop getting in our own way." 2 years later, Mason woke to the sound of laughter drifting through the farmhouse windows. Outside, he could see Caroline and Tyler, now 12 and showing signs of the lanky teenager he was becoming, working together in the expanded vegetable garden. Caroline's hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, her expensive manicure replaced by dirt under her fingernails, and she'd never looked more beautiful. The Reed Foundation had grown beyond anyone's expectations, funding renewable energy education programs in 43 states and helping hundreds of military families transition to civilian careers in sustainable technology. But Mason's favorite part was the small workshop they'd built behind the barn, where Caroline taught weekend classes for local kids interested in solar engineering. Watching her explain photovoltaic cells to 8-year-olds with the same intensity she'd once brought to billion-dollar board meetings never failed to make him smile. Tyler had become something of a celebrity in their small community, not because of his stepmother's wealth, but because of his science fair projects that kept winning state competitions. His latest achievement was a water purification system powered entirely by solar energy, designed to help communities in drought-affected areas. When reporters asked him about his inspiration, he always mentioned his mom. Both of them, Caroline and the mother he barely remembered, but whose love had shaped the man his father had become. "Dad," Tyler called from the garden, "Caroline wants to know if you think the tomatoes are ready for harvest." Mason smiled at the way his son still called her Caroline rather than Mom, not out of distance, but out of respect for the memory they all carried. Caroline had never tried to replace Sarah, and Tyler had never expected her to. Instead, they'd built something new together, a family structure that honored the past while embracing the future. The Purple Heart still sat in its place of honor on the kitchen mantelpiece, but now it was surrounded by other mementos: Tyler's science fair ribbons, a photo from Caroline's last board meeting, Mason's Farmer of the Year award from the County Agricultural Association. The medal no longer felt like a burden from the past, but rather a reminder that heroism came in many forms, from split-second decisions on foreign battlefields to daily choices made in kitchen conversations and garden planning sessions. Mason walked outside to join his family, his bare feet comfortable on the warm earth he'd learned to work with his hands and his heart. The morning sun painted everything in shades of gold: the corn stalks, Caroline's hair, Tyler's animated face as he explained his latest invention. In the distance, the solar panels of the Reed Solar Farm caught the light, sending clean energy into the grid that powered thousands of homes across Southern California. "What are you thinking about?" Caroline asked, noticing the contemplative expression on his face. Mason pulled her close, Tyler automatically joining their embrace with the unconscious ease of long practice. "Just this," he said, gesturing at the farm, the mountains, the endless blue sky above them. "How lucky we are to have found each other." Caroline smiled, the kind of smile that reached all the way to her eyes and made everything else fade into insignificance. "Lucky had nothing to do with it," she said softly. "You chose to stop and help a stranger. You chose to forgive my mistakes. You chose to build something beautiful out of something broken." Mason considered this, watching Tyler chase one of the chickens around the yard with the boundless energy of youth. "Maybe we both did," he said finally. "Maybe that's what love really is, a series of choices to keep showing up for each other, no matter what." As the sun climbed higher, painting their small corner of the world in warm light and infinite possibility, Mason Reed understood that heroes didn't always wear uniforms or carry weapons. Sometimes they wore work clothes and calloused hands. Sometimes they showed up in expensive cars and designer dresses, looking for something money couldn't buy. And sometimes, if they were very fortunate, they found each other on forgotten highways and learned that the most important rescues were the ones that saved not just lives, but hearts. The story didn't end there, of course. Stories like theirs never really ended, just evolved into new chapters filled with ordinary days and extraordinary love. But in that moment, standing in the garden with the two people who mattered most in the world, Mason knew that some rescues were worth everything, and some families were worth fighting for, no matter what the cost.